And yes, we're on the record.
Very good. Well, it's my great pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce Frank von Hippel to give today's colloquium. Professor von Hippel has been one of the world's most influential voices in the discussion of nuclear issues for over 50 years. That's a long while. He started out as a theoretical particle physicist. His grandfather was actually a physics Nobel Prize winner. But he became more and more involved in the human consequences of nuclear science. So after 10 years, he transitioned completely to working on physics-related policy matters. And he's now a senior research physicist and professor emeritus of public and international affairs with Princeton's program on science and global security, which he co-founded. So, Professor von Hippel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip. I wish I were influential, or more influential than I've been. So let me just get my share screen up here. So this is actually the first second talk from our panel of speakers for the Physicist Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. You are the first place, and so I've had to make a completely new talk because you heard a talk about 18 months ago from Steve Fetter, which I'm sure you remember everything in great detail. But so I'm going to talk less about the technicalities of how nuclear weapons work and such things, and really have a greater emphasis on policy. And the first thing I think that Steve probably impressed on you is that this is in fact a very great danger, and I have a quote here on my title slide where the UN Secretary General recently said, "Humanity remains one misunderstanding, one misstep, one miscalculation, one pushed button away from annihilation." And unfortunately, that's true, even though this issue has been much less visible, since the end of the Cold War. In fact, I felt also at the end of the Cold War that maybe we had, maybe the danger it was over. But unfortunately, it isn't, and that's why we a couple of years ago founded this Physicist Coalition, and to try to raise the profile of this issue in the physics community, and get and then have the physics community raise the profile again in the public debate, and particularly focusing on Congress. So my talk, I am going to just remind you of how serious this is. Talk first about the consequences and probability of nuclear war. Then the new dimension that is now developing, the three-way nuclear arms race with Russia and China. There's a review that the Biden administration, as all since Clinton, the Clinton administration, all administrations have begun with a nuclear posture review. So that's ongoing and should be delivered soon. And then I'll tell some encouraging stories. I find encouraging anyway that physicists have had an impact on policy in the past. And then talk about what issues the Physicist Coalition has been engaging with, and a couple of other things about the coalition. And then my understanding is that for people who are interested, you can stay on after the hour is over, and Charlotte Shelton, who's here, and I will meet with whoever's interested in talking further about the coalition. So the consequences of a nuclear war would be horrendous. And to set that stage, the first president who asked what the consequences would be was President Kennedy in 1961. He asked the US Strategic Air Command, now succeeded by the Strategic Command, which has oversight over the nuclear submarines as well as the bombers and the missiles. He asked them how many people, its single integrated operations plan. We had only one plan for using nuclear weapons at the time. How many people would be killed? And the answer came back, 400 million people in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. And then depending on which way the wind blew, maybe a couple 100 million people in Western Europe, Japan, and South Asia as a result of all the fallout from that attack. Now, the US thanks to the drawdown, well, thanks to a couple of developments, weapons became more accurate, so you didn't need to blow up the whole neighborhood or as large a neighborhood. And because of the drawdown after the Cold War, US megatonnage is down by a factor of 10 today. But those consequences were only from a US attack. And of course, there would be Soviet and Chinese attacks either before or after. And also China's, of course, become much more urbanized. So many more people would be killed in China. But there's also the indirect effects of a nuclear war, and those would include an economic collapse and nuclear winter effects on crops, so that we could be talking about billions of deaths. Just on the so-called nuclear winter effects, which finally, after 40 years, Congress has asked the national academies to do a study on. These effects would be from cities burning. I mean, all those people dying, a lot of them would be from fire. And this shows a calculation that was done for 400 megatons of nuclear explosions. The US by itself has about 2,000 megatons on its weapon systems, creating 100 megatons of black soot, which would rise into the stratosphere and stay for a long time, 7-year half-life, they calculate. And on the top map, you see the climate zones on the Earth before such a nuclear war, and with the colors, the purple being very short, sort of like a 25-day growing season, and in the bottom slide you see after the year after this happened, those Antarctic type climate zones in much of the northern hemisphere, and so it's serious. It's a serious. Having a nuclear war is very serious, and that, with regard to the probability, of course, that's I think since we haven't had a nuclear war in the 77 years, I think, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people assume that we won't have a nuclear war, but we've had many close calls. And I just mentioned that, well, first of all, we have a launch and warning posture. We, of our intercontinental ballistic missiles systems. Russia has one too, and China is considering that. And we know of 3 false alarms during the Cold War. And in all those 3 cases, the fact that the alarms were false was only established after the time allowed to the early warning crews to make that determination had expired. And they gave the good news, and then they were fired for not reporting on time. And another one in false alarming in Europe. We had this is actually just weeks before I made my first trip to Moscow. The Soviet Union concluded that a NATO exercise, which was programmed to end with a simulated nuclear attack on Eastern Europe, that it was real, and the Soviets started loading bombs for either a preemptive or retaliatory attack. So these are close calls due to false warnings and misunderstandings. But then there's of course other ways in which we could have a nuclear war, and including confrontations. We came very close to a nuclear war in 1961 over the Soviets blocking our access to West Berlin. And the Kennedy administration debated various nuclear attacks. They were going to probe first, assumed that the military tried to go down the Autobahn to Berlin, but they assumed that they would be stopped and they couldn't really get through. And then the next step was going to be a nuclear attack. And it was only because the Soviets defused the crisis, which was really driven by the fact that so many East Germans were escaping through West Berlin, that the Soviets, instead of decided to cut that off physically with the Berlin Wall, and that resolved the issue, and they allowed the US and UK and France access again to West Berlin. And by the way, to me, Taiwan looks like today's West Berlin in the developing Cold War between the US and China. It's very scary. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the most famous, well-known crisis over nuclear weapons, occurred as a result of the West Berlin crisis, when the US announced that we had nuclear superiority, which we did at the time, to the extent nuclear superiority was meaningful. And that panicked Khrushchev into trying to balance the situation by moving short or medium and intermediate range Soviet missiles into Cuba. And then, of course, we have this new problem of hacking, complicating these very short time, the situation with these very short timelines that we've given ourselves for launch on warning. So this is just to remind you that this is dangerous. The subject. Now, so let me just also remind you of the situation with regard to the stockpiles. They went down after the end of the Cold War in 1989, and we're down. We and Russia are down to about 4,000 operational warheads each, about half of which are deployed. And then there's 7 other countries. And on this scale, they don't even, if you look closely, you can see different colored lines along the axis. And so they didn't really seem to matter, on this scale, but of course they do. Having a couple of hundred nuclear weapons is enough to be able to spoil the world's day. And China, or before we get to that, most of the nuclear weapons today are aimed at each other, or the control systems, the command and control systems associated with each other. And this is the last published, about 20 years old now, calculation of the consequences of one of these attacks. I did these kinds of calculations in the 1980s, but those are very obviously dated. And this just shows you the fallout, huge plumes of fallout that would result from attacks where the explosion would be so very close to the ground because of these big plumes are from attacks on hypothetical attacks on missile silos, which are very hard. But you see, this calculation, which is on the web, it's a report, estimated from these attacks, just on the nuclear weapons themselves, tens of millions of deaths. Now, just so you can see, on the right-hand side of this picture is what a US ICBM silo looks like. These are called Minutemen missiles because they can be launched in minutes. They were designed to be able to do so, so that they could get off and away before a Soviet missile on a timeline of between launch and arrival of between 20 and 30 minutes could get there and take them out because they're obviously targetable. And originally the Soviet missiles were so inaccurate that there was pretty low probability of them landing close enough to a missile silo to destroy it. But they became more accurate. Our missiles became more accurate, and that is what resulted in the launch on warning posture. So you see here on the left, we used to have 1,000 of these missiles, along with ballistic missile submarines and nuclear bombers. We're down to 450 now, or 400 now, with 150 silos at three different associated with 3 different air bases in the Great Plains. Well, just last year, we found that the Chinese were getting into this business as well. They have, and on a large scale, they have they're building 3 silo fields with about 100 silos each. So comparable to what we in the Soviet and the Russians have. Actually, the Russians have put a lot of their intercontinental ballistic missiles, made them mobile. That turned out not to be politically possible here, and so you see down in the left-hand corner here the most likely missile to go into those silos. In fact, it's interesting that it's labeled in Latin letters, the 41. I think it's the East Dong Fong. I think it is. It's the East Wind. The DF stands for. And I have circled the Taiwan there, just which is becoming a trigger point for a U.S.-Chinese confrontation. The Chinese have really been developing missiles to make it impossible for our aircraft carriers to come within range of defending Taiwan. And Xi Jinping, the hardline leader, seeming to focus and have exercises sort of threatening Taiwan. It's sort of similar to the kinds of exercises we're seeing right now, so-called exercises threatening Ukraine. Well, let me just put on, it's a little hard to advance here. Okay, so this is the situation with regard to China's nuclear warheads. And here I'm only showing the warheads able to reach the United States. And for a long time, China was satisfied having tens of warheads able to reach the United States. And then there were two developments. One was George Bush the Younger took the United States out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which limited, it was a bilateral treaty with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, which limited our both sides' missile defenses. In the 1970s, we discovered that we were getting into an offense-defense race, and we were smart enough to say, okay, well, let's not do that by limiting our defenses. But George Bush, after the end of the Cold War, George Bush said, well, we don't have to worry about the Soviet Union and Russia anymore, but we do have to worry about North Korea, or missiles from North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And so he took us out of that treaty. That made both Russia and China very worried. And then the other factor, I think, that it changed China's policy is Xi Jinping. He's a real hardliner, and has abandoned the policy of peaceful rise that Deng Xiaoping initiated, that was so successful for China. So you can see that there has been an increase to about 200 long-range warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles and on ballistic missile submarines. And then with these new 300 new silos, China could, the Pentagon is talking about China going up to 1,000 of these strategic warheads by 2030, assuming, I think, that the DF-41s would have 3 warheads each, which we, of course, don't know. So it's become a 3-way situation. Now, the Pentagon, well, I can't see the top of my screen. Let's see whether I can get rid of this little bar. Well, I don't know how to get rid of it, but anyway, I think this is about the nuclear posture review, and I guess you can't. Is it blocking your view as well? This little bar along the top.
We're okay.
Yeah, we're okay.
Okay. the Biden administration is doing this nuclear posture review, and there are two different agendas involved here. The Pentagon is focused on hardware. All of our intercontinental ballistic missiles, our ballistic missile submarines, and our strategic bombers are getting old, and so their program is to replace them all. The 400 ICBMs and 450 silos, 12 ballistic missile submarines, 100 new stealthy strategic bombers, which would be mostly for conventional purposes, but some of them would be have nuclear weapons at their bases, and that would include 1,000 stealthy air-launched cruise missiles. And I just show the contractors here because that's part of the politics. And you see that below, this is the peaks that we've had in their expenditures on the waves of expenditures we've had on the term is modernizing, or with new generations of so-called delivery vehicles. The first buildup was the Eisenhower-Kennedy period, then came the Reagan-Bush period, and now we have, we're going into another wave of expenditures. Now, people argue that this is very affordable because our defense budget is around $700 billion, so this is 5 or 6% of that huge total. So that's the Pentagon agenda. And then there's the arms control agenda, and the arms controllers really include Biden, President Biden, who's been very interested in these issues in his career as a senator and as a vice president. And on the arms controller agendas is the lobbying for change was that the U.S. should develop a no first use policy, should declare a no first use policy. We should get away from this dangerous launch on warning posture for the ICBMs. We will need a new U.S.-Russia strategic arms limitations agreement. The current one, New START, will expire in 2026. And we somehow have to get China into and we have to start negotiating with China over its build-up. And then sort of, I have in parentheses, limiting, getting back to limiting ballistic missile defense to defuse these offense-defense arms races that we've gotten into. And I'll come back to that. But it looks, given the poisonous politics we have right now, it looks like having a new treaties for the foreseeable future will be impossible. Treaties require 67 votes to be ratified by the Senate. In 1999, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty failed ratification. The New START Treaty was ratified, but only in exchange for President Obama committing to this complete renewal of all the U.S. nuclear weapon systems and the associated infrastructure. You can't sell that again. I mean, and then I think what we would look forward to in the future, be looking at for the foreseeable future, would be executive agreements. The Iran nuclear deal, for example, which we're trying to get back into, limiting Iran's nuclear program, was an executive agreement, and it was in Congress. The majority in Congress was actually against it. The Republicans pretty much all of them, and a number of Democrats, including my senator from New Jersey, Senator Menendez, who happens to be the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so the Iran nuclear deal was saved by the Senate filibuster, which is blocking so many things now, but there were only 42 senators voted in favor of the Iran deal, but that was more than the minimum 40 required to block progress. Now, just to give you some encouraging stories, physicists have made a difference in the past, and I just want to give you a few of these stories. It started actually right after World War II, when Congress proposed to leave all of nuclear research under Army control. And the younger generation of Manhattan Project physicists had had enough of the Army. And they created the Federation of Atomic Scientists, now the Federation of American Scientists. And they persuaded Congress to set up, to put the nuclear research under civilian control. And that was the Atomic Energy Commission. And then after the 70s, it became the Department of Energy. And Robert Wilson, a very interesting man, who had been at Los Alamos, was the first chairman of the Federation. And later, and many of you probably know of him as the founding director of the Fermi Lab. I recommend, I read this book, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'd been on my shelf for a long time because I thought it was only about Oppenheimer, but it turned out to be about that whole period, the early nuclear period. And I learned about Wilson in that book, so I recommend it. The older Manhattan Project scientists, also in 1946, met in Princeton, and to organize an emergency coalition to finance. They wanted to raise $1 million to finance an education campaign to explain the dangers to the American public. I just labeled, I don't have to label Einstein, but I labeled a couple of people behind him that Leo Szilard may not be known to most of you, but he was the man who invented the chain reaction, and then he also invented nuclear arms control. A very interesting guy, and I recommend another book, very good book I read recently about Leo Szilard. And then Hans Bethe, who will appear later, who had a very long engagement with nuclear arms control as both an insider and an outsider. He played both roles. And there are others there, but I won't identify them. Then there was the ending of nuclear testing in the atmosphere. And here it was actually there were a couple of important contributions by scientists. One of them was a physical chemist, Linus Pauling, and they were, and the other one on the right is, of course, Andrei Sakharov. And they were both concerned about the radioactive fallout. Actually, Sakharov was more concerned, and Pauling was too, was concerned about all the carbon-14 being made in the atmosphere by these atmospheric tests. And that carbon-14 would get into the biological pool and cause a lot of grief for its 5,700-year half-life and beyond. The picture of Pauling on the left is when he was demonstrating in front of the White House in 1962. And he had been invited to dinner with all the US Nobel Prize winners with President Kennedy. But so he took the opportunity to demonstrate before going in for dinner. And Sakharov's role was as more of an insider. He argued with Khrushchev that these big tests that the Soviet Union was carrying out were unnecessary and were generating, we're going to cause all sorts of genetic damage in the future. He didn't succeed immediately, but he did have an impact. And after the fright of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Khrushchev and Kennedy decided that they would, in fact, to show that they weren't crazy, they would end atmospheric nuclear testing. And the best estimate is that about 3 million cancers, about half fatal, will result from, many of them in the future because of carbon-14 will result from that period. Ironically, the carbon-14 effect is being reduced by all the carbon the fossil carbon we're pumping into the atmosphere to dilute it. So that's one positive effect of our carbon emissions. Here's pictures, data on the right again, and Richard Garwin, who I understand has gotten two honorary degrees from, he told me, from Case Western Reserve. They published, they were both advisors, presidential science advisors during the early period, the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson period. Johnson, when Johnson decided that he would deploy ballistic missile defenses, they've been telling him that it would be ineffective and provocative. But he ignored them, and then they went, Garwin and Beta went public. And that was actually my first exposure to an arms control analysis, reading their Scientific American article, and that inspired me, along with a lot of other young physicists at the time, to go and try to educate our, the locals about this, and it turned out to have an impact because the Army made the mistake. The interceptors at the time were not hit to kill like they are today. They were nuclear armed, including the long range interceptors had a 5 megaton, 5 million tons, so 300 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. Warheads. And the Army decided that to put them in the suburbs, and this resulted in a not in my backyard movement, which got Congress's attention. And in fact, as a result of the combination of the arguments being made by the physicists and the uprising against these ballistic missiles, they weren't deployed, and instead we got a treaty limiting ballistic missiles defense. And then very formative event, uprising. This is a general uprising, public uprising that really influenced me and many others. Was the so-called freeze movement, where physicists were not leaders; but many of us participated, and this was. You can see by this, I like this picture because you can see how broad-based this movement was. The banner says 177 out of 195 Vermont towns voted for the nuclear arms freeze. That was a tactic to go to the local governments and then the state governments to put pressure to end the arms race. People were really scared at the beginning of the Reagan administration, because some of the for one reason, some of the officials in the Defense Department were arguing that the Soviet Union thought it could fight and win a nuclear war, and that maybe they were right. Maybe we could fight, or at least we had to give the impression that we thought we could fight and win a nuclear war to determine them, to deter them. So then let me just talk about the current issue on which the Physicist Coalition has been lobbying. It's no first use, and President Biden likes to call it sole purpose. And that formulation is that the sole purpose of U.S. possession of nuclear weapons is to deter their use by other nuclear armed states. And so the implication is that if other countries get rid of their nuclear weapons, we will too. But in fact, most members of Congress and the governments of Japan, Eastern Europe, especially, are opposed to this. And this has been a battle in the Biden administration nuclear posture review. It was also a battle at the end of the Obama administration. Basically, their argument is we should keep all options on the table to deter things like Russia attacking Western Europe, or invading the Baltics is a typical scenario that people talk about, or China bullying Japan, and there is, the U.S. has made nuclear threats, but not in recent in the past, but not in recent decades. When we were in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, we made nuclear threats. They didn't really have an impact, although some people think, well, you would argue that they did. But there is a fundamental thing that McGeorge Bundy, who was President Kennedy's national security advisor, called existential deterrence. And it's the kind of deterrence that, that you don't, if a policeman is, if you're having a confrontation with a policeman and he has a gun in his holster, you don't punch him in the nose, but you're deterred from punching him in the nose. And so just having nuclear weapons raises the threshold for war, and that's what why people like nuclear weapons. But with that benefit comes the danger of that I talked about at the beginning of the talk of nuclear war by mistake, stupidity, or hacking. Well, just the next issue, I think that we'll get involved, that the Physicist Coalition will get involved in, will be ballistic missile defense. And yesterday there was a rollout. Some of you probably were on the webinar of a report some of us did on explaining that we have spent $350 billion over this long time period, 60 years that I show here of the budgets in 2020 dollars on this, and we haven't got much to show for it. But we do on the other side have these buildups in China's case, a quantitative buildup, and in Russia's case, because they're limited by the New START treaty, that they are developing new types of weapons to go under our ballistic missile defense, including intercontinental nuclear-powered torpedoes and cruise missiles. and these hypersonic glide vehicles that you've probably heard about, the reentry vehicles. I just show here briefly the history of the funding, and the first buildup when President Johnson ignored his science advisors was because President Nixon, or future President Nixon, presidential candidate Nixon, was arguing that there was a gap, a BMD gap, like the missile gap that Kennedy had used against him when Nixon was running against Kennedy. Then that, I've explained how that ended. And then President Reagan, inspired in part by Edward Teller, the so-called father of the H-bomb, became convinced that with new technologies, including Teller's X-ray nuclear dome-powered lasers, we could shoot down the Soviet missiles. And then President Bush decided we had to have ballistic missile defense against North Korea and Iran. Now, this is a slide that was shown yesterday, and just briefly, they're talked about 3 phases of a ballistic missile flight from North Korea to the United States. A boost phase, where if you could get close enough, you might be able to shoot down the ICB, North Korean ICBM, while it was still boosting at the warheads, 3 to 5 minutes. We don't have anything there, but people talk about that. There's a terminal phase, which really lasts only tens of seconds when the warheads are coming through the atmosphere. There's some discussion of trying to adapt the Army's an Army system against shorter range missiles. For example, in being used in Saudi Arabia against the missiles that Yemen has been firing in Saudi Arabia, but the emphasis has been on mid-course. That's the longest time, longest period in the ballistic missile trajectory. And we have 40 of these long-range interceptors in Alaska and 4 in California. And now we're deploying on destroyers and possibly on land much smaller interceptors, which developed to intercept shorter range missiles originally aimed at aircraft carriers and so on, but which might be able to be used to intercept these intercontinental ballistic missiles. But all of this mid-course is plagued by what Galileo pointed out, that light objects travel as fast in the vacuum as heavy objects, and so you can deploy all sorts of lightweight deceptive objects to accompany a warhead. This shows an example. In space, you can, until they're stripped away in those last tens of seconds of reentry through the atmosphere. And this shows an example of a warhead concealed inside an aluminized balloon with all sorts of other balloons around it. And so our report concluded that, in fact, we hadn't accomplished much with these $350 billion we spent on ballistic missile defense, and then maybe Congress should think about the costs and benefits. So just briefly, then my last 2 slides. On the Physicist Coalition, we're up to about 650 members in the last year and a half, still growing. Hopefully some of you are members. And the members, we have been educating Congress on issues that the American Physical Society has positions on. And those included extending the New Start Treaty, which President Biden did at the last minute. It was about to expire when he came in. We've opposed funding for new nuclear weapon tests, which was being discussed inside the Trump administration and by the when the Republicans had a majority in the Senate. Only North Korea has tested since 1996, and I think that's a good thing. And in fact, the Congress decided to drop the funding that was in the Senate version of the fiscal year 2021 Defense Authorization Bill. I've talked about no first use. There's been a letter from 55 Democrats to President Biden supporting no first use. And then there's the new issue of the ballistic missile defense. And then just finally, just a thought. We've been talking about how to support chapters at universities where there are members of the Physicist Coalition, but we haven't figured out how to do that yet. But we don't have the resources to do that yet. But it could be a local initiative. And a couple of things that we do here at Princeton and have been done at a few other universities is we collaborate with like-minded community groups to go, if you have a group of constituents to go with, you're much more likely to meet with and spend time with your representative or senator. And we do this on a regular basis. And it builds up relationships with the key staffers on these issues. And then, of course, you can organize courses and policy workshops and teach-ins to educate yourselves and interested students. So that's it. I'm as usual, I've gone longer than I should have, but I'll stop unsharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. That was very informative. We've got a bunch of questions that were in the chat, and we also have some hands raised here. Annette was asking a question, which I think was related to the fact that US doesn't ratify very much.
Right.
We get presidential agreements for things, and then we generally tend to agree, follow what the rules are, but we never get a Senate that ratifies anything. How can other countries be trustful of us, particularly given some of the wild oscillations that we've seen just recently?
I've been developed a relationship with some Iranian journalists who keep asking me this question, and they do email interviews with me, and this keeps coming up. As most of you know, I'm sure President Trump took us out of the agreement with Iran, and the Biden administration has been trying to get us back in. And one of the questions, one of the things that the Iranians have been saying is, can you guarantee that if you're back in, your successor or the Congress won't take you out again? And the answer has been no, we can't. So it is a problem, and I think it stems back to, well, we've got a particular serious problem of polarization right now, but it goes back, I think, to George Washington and not wanting us to get entangling foreign alliances, and that's why the treaties, you had to have a 2-to-1 majority in the Senate to approve a treaty. And that's these days that's unobtainable.
Yes.
So I can't answer the question.
It was a good question.
But I can agree with it.
Madison has a question asking if you could go into some detail about the threat of hacking.
Yeah, it is a concern I mean, the command and control system of our ICBMs in particular are very old and so difficult to hack, but they're being modernized, and so this is a concern that they could be hacked into, and that a hacker could either figure out how to launch the missiles or fool us into believing that we're being attacked. Unfortunately, the military's primary concern has been to make sure that they could be launched, and not on preventing their launch. And in fact, when there's a test flight of a Minuteman missile out of the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California over the Pacific, there's a self-destruct system installed in case the missile goes in the wrong direction. Those self-destruct systems are taken out when the nuclear warhead is put on, and sometimes these, a couple of times these missiles have tried to launch themselves, and what the Air Force has done is actually parked trucks on top of the missile, on the saddle covers. The saddle covers would open with an explosive charge, and the hope was that the truck would fall down on top of the missile and prevent it from being launched. So so I forget what the question was, but that's the answer.
The truck is a secret defense mechanism. Is I think Asher Payton, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I actually have like a number of questions. That was a really great talk, and it has not made it any easier to sleep at night, but I guess it's good to hear. So I guess the first question is a simple question I had at the beginning when you were just about some of the charts that you showed. The first question I had was the chart you showed about the growing periods. Were those growing periods, like the differences, was that just the first 2 years with the nuclear winter, or was that like the 40-year period afterward?
It eases off with this sort of, this was immediately after, I think the first.
This is immediately after. So this so that part like could be potentially, I don't know how, with sufficient stores of grain and non-perishable proteins, that could be, maybe that storm could be weathered. Maybe, I don't know. That's just me being maybe optimistic.
This is the biblical strategy of 7 years of.
7 years of bad years, really bad years.
Yeah.
And
we don't have that now, but
yeah,
you're right.
But then, another technical question I had about the graph. There was just a graph I was confused about, but it's not super important. But the other question I had is, so you mentioned, and this is a question I think about a lot, just other ways, like whether or not like increasing our ballistic missile defense is a good thing. Because on the one hand, right, like this is asymmetric warfare you're fighting, right? You can easily deploy, 15 decoy missiles, and there's, it's very hard to tell which of those are the nuclear warheads. And so it becomes hard to shoot them all down, and you can do a bunch of other strategies to like basically increase the volume or apparent volume of your offense and thus make it hard to defend against. So on that ground, ballistic missile defense is somewhat doomed just by the asymmetry of the problem. But on the other hand, as someone who doesn't want the world to be destroyed in nuclear fire, it seems like to me, if you're going to develop anything, right, it should be defense, not offense, right? Like we should be, right, if like given that we can't, that we're, I guess, assuming that people stick to treaties and don't make more nuclear weapons, we should be I mean, I guess this might be a more radical idea, but what if we like,
Sure, if I may interrupt a bit, this is becoming less of a question and more of a point of view, and maybe we could leave this to the discussion period.
oh, that's fine. Yeah, sorry.
Had a chance to ask
course.
questions. I think Alan Rock had a question. Would you like to ask it, or shall I read it out? Okay, Alan Rock's question.
You can read it, please.
Oh, okay. Can you give an update about the apparent incipient arms race re hypersonic weapons? We hear claims that we are far behind, quote, Russia and China.
Yes, I don't think we are necessarily, and I think the hypersonic weapons have been hyped. Their advantages are that they're maneuverable, and therefore you can't. It's unlike the ballistic missile trajectory. You know, it's not exactly predictable where they will be. I think they may be of more interest for conventional warfare than for nuclear warfare. You know, I don't really. I mean, it is something that you could have a separate colloquium on. I haven't gotten too deeply into it myself, so maybe I'll just leave it there.
Very good. Bob Brown, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it?
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
Okay. Bob says, very much on everyone's mind is Ukraine. Is it confusing to think about whether at this point it's best that Ukraine has eliminated its nuclear stockpile?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that situation?
Yeah, that was actually I went to Ukraine in 1987 as part of a group to try to talk the Ukrainians out of their nuclear weapons. I think if they hadn't given them up, there probably would have been a war at that point, where the Russians would have insisted on taking them or destroying them. But you know, I'm glad that they did get rid of them. But they, you know, it is a pretty awful situation right now. And in fact, you can see the role of existential deterrence in Biden making very clear that we're not going to get involved in that war. And mentioning the fact that Russia is a nuclear armed country as part of the explanation of why we're not, but then drawing the line with regard to the NATO allies.
Okay, we're getting a little short of time, so I'll just use my privilege here to close with a question of my own, which is related to the movie Don't Look Up.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but you mentioned these 5 megaton warheads that were developed for missile defense. And I gather they're still sticking around in storage somewhere. And
Yeah.
the reasoning was that we might need them to deflect any incoming asteroid. Do I have that correct? Or is that...
You do. They are those warheads, which were retired in 1972, 3, 4, are still at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the so-called Y-12 facility. I think they may have been dismantled. I think, but the components, I mean, at the Y-12 facility, the thermonuclear secondary is stored, and the so-called primaries, the plutonium triggers, are stored at the Pantex facility in Texas, and blocking the town. So, and the argument for keeping them, the labs made, the labs were quite, the weapons labs were quite interested in this, you know, in the possible need of a nuclear weapon to deflect an asteroid. I think, not sure whether you could deflect a comet. Which was where it was discovered too late to deflect by lesser means. And of course, you know the saying that to a carpenter who only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so
Okay,
that's their hammer.
well, thank you very much. I think there are probably other questions, but we'll end the formal recorded session now.
And I'm happy to receive emails if people want to have things that they want to discuss.
Very good. So we'll carry on with the discussion, but it won't be on the record anymore.
Okay,
I think Harsh has his finger on